that of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of gods and religions that humanity has invented in its time, we have three, roughly, and only three, not roughly, only three alternatives in considering them. One is that all of them are true. One is that all of them are false, and the other is that only one of them is true. The first proposition is self-evidently absurd. They can't conceivably all be true. Indeed, there are mutually exclusive forms of Christianity, just to take only one religion. That all are false seems at least possible. That only one is true is the position, say, of my opponent, Dr. Lennox, I think must be the hardest single position to take. But in the spirit of it, I'll assume Christianity, and I'll just remind you of a novel that probably most of you won't have heard of, but was once very famous. It was called When It Was Dark. Has anyone heard of it or read it? It was a huge bestseller just before the First World War. It was by a man called Guy Thorne. And the mise en scène of the novel is this, that news comes from Palestine that a grave has been opened, and that in this grave, the stone rolled away from the tomb. On a stone inside is the body of a man who's been scourged, crucified, had a crown of thorns pressed down on his head, and has a terrible wound in his side, an almost perfectly preserved cadaver. And on the news of this terrible archaeological discovery, the world undergoes a complete moral collapse. Because without the resurrection, or with definite proof that there was no such thing, that the resurrection was a fabrication, there's no further moral restraint on humanity. People are coupling like beasts in the streets. They give themselves up to plunder and theft and rape and murder and perjury without conscience. A midnight of civilization falls upon an unhappy world until it's finally discovered that the whole thing was a fabrication put around by sinister Jewish people and journalists and other untrustworthy riffraff as a stunt, and then people can go back to being moral again. Well, you see where, perhaps you can guess where I might be headed with this. In my view, if every one of the gods that have been discredited, instead of only the two or three left to us that haven't yet been completely shown up as man-made fabrications and joined Thor and Ashtaroth and Huitzilopochtli and the Aztecs and all the others, if all of these were proven to be fraudulent and false and man-made, I believe our moral dilemmas would be exactly the ones we face now. All of us, atheist, agnostic, philosophical, Socratic, or true believer. We would still have to wonder about the purpose of our existence here. We would still have to wonder about the origins of the cosmos and of nature. We would still have to wonder about our duties to one another. We would still have to wonder about how to build the just city, how to reflect on truth and on beauty. All of these dilemmas would remain exactly the way they are. They're unaltered by any supernatural dimension. And our subject tonight is the supernatural dimension itself, the chieftain of that dimension, the concept of God. So I want to begin by clarifying why it is that I believe there is no such entity or person, and I want to go on to say why I'm relieved when I reflect that this is so, why I think it would be horrible if it were true or otherwise. And I think I'd have to begin with a distinction between theism and deism. Even Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 proofs of the existence of God, for example, are, strictly speaking, hardly theological at all. They're essentially only deistic. They're about first causes, or uncaused potential, or latent causes. They derive the idea of a creator from various gaps and from observation of the rhythms and the patterns of nature and the cosmos, and they postulate that these rhythms and patterns would make no sense without a first cause. In short, they postulate nothing more than the argument from design, which, as you all know, is subject to a refutation that says, well, if there was a designer, then the designer must himself have been designed, and threatens those who offer the case with an infinite regression into a chaos. However, I would say it's not possible to refute this argument conclusively or utterly or finally. Only one can point out, as I will, some gross absurdities and inconsistencies in it. But for this evening, and for the purposes of tonight, why don't I simply grant that it could be true, that there was an original creator, and that that's a good and elegant explanation for how at least the cosmos and the process of life on Earth, two quite different things, got started. Why don't I just grant the deist his point? After all, in the time that I've written the most about, at the time of Thomas Jefferson and the time of Thomas Paine, both of those gentlemen deists, an intelligent person would probably have had no choice but to believe something very like that. There's no superstition to it. There's nothing supernatural about it. But it leaves the theist, like my learned opponent, with all, if I make this concession, it leaves him with all his work still to come. He still has to show, somehow, not only that there is a God, but that he himself understands the mind of that God, knows the will, or can interpret the will and wishes of that deity on such weighty questions as what is good, what is evil, what foods may be requisite, or what foods may be profane, what sexual partnerships are allowed, what sexual positions indeed are licit or legitimate, what days of the week are holy or otherwise, whether it is requisite to mutilate the genitals of children. Major questions where someone has to say, yes, I know we must do this because I happen to know what God wants us to do. Now, it's my submission, ladies and gentlemen, and I think it's a fairly modest one, that brilliant as a mathematician Dr. Lennox may be, no person, no other human being, no other primate, no fellow mammal of mine, however clever they may be, is in any position to say that they know God's will, or God's word, or God's desire or intention. This information is not accessible to human beings, and therefore my first statement is this: those who do claim that they know are already, in a sense, discredited. They're deluded, and in a sense, they're the first ones who have to concede that the argument goes on without them, because we have to be awed, all of us, more and more, all the time, more and more awed at that, as we discover how much more there is to know by how little of it we do know or can know. It's only those who say that they know they are certain who we have to distrust a priori, if I can use that expression. Very well, hoping I've established that point, just for the sake of the debate. We don't have a word adeist, though I think we should. I would say I was an adeist as well as an atheist. I don't believe there was a prime mover. I don't believe there was a first cause of a divine kind. I think we have better and further and brighter explanations for the origins of things than the idea of a supernatural first cause. But some also would say we don't even really need the word atheist, because after all, I don't require a special term. When I tell you I don't believe in a tooth fairy, you don't say, well, what's the word for someone who doesn't do that? When I say I don't believe in witches and I don't believe in the biblical injunction to kill them either, they don't say, what is it to be a non-believer in witches and witchcraft? When I say to a Muslim, your prophet believes in dust devils and jinns and the haunting spirits of the desert, shows what nonsensical peasant superstition is involved in the Muslim profession of faith. No one says to me, what word are you using to say you don't believe in dust devils and jinns? I think I can be generally credited with having good reasons for my doubt. However, I think that the challenge is a fair one, because I think we are divided as between those of us who attribute our presence here to the laws of biology and the laws of physics, and those of us who, and we're modest in doing that, I think, we say we submit ourselves to the evidence, and even if it comes up with conclusions that aren't very welcome to us, we will accept them if they're well-founded, and those who are conceited enough, I would say, arrogant enough, in fact, to think that they are here as the consequence of a divine design. There's all the difference in the world between those two worldviews, and the big difference is one of them has evidence for it and the other doesn't. And one of them will say in advance what would refute it. I can tell you, if you ask me, what evidence, if presented, would mean I'd have to change my mind, and the theist will never do that. He will never tell you in advance, show me this and I'll stop believing in it. There's always an infinite replenishment of the infinitely renewable resource of faith going on. In fact, it's the humility of it that makes me laugh at it in a way the most. They say that they're humble, these believers in God. They want to be written up as modest, because they think that, of course, that God tells them they're worms, originally sinful, ingrates, incurable, made out of dust in one narrative, out of a clot of blood in the Quranic narrative, bad, off to a pretty shaky start, condemned since an original fall of man. Nonetheless, cheer up. The universe is designed with you in mind. This is a depraved form of sadomasochism in my view. It's not good for you to go from this terrible abjection and serfdom in the one instance to this belief that you are the center of creation and the object of the cosmos in the other. It's a terrible alternation, an erotic alternation between being much too servile and much too arrogant. But just locally, what would it be to believe this? Suppose you did believe that everything that had brought us here was by design. Well, we know that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed just on this planet have become extinct. So heaven has already watched almost 100% of its creation die off, often in very unpleasant, callous circumstances, with folded arms, right? And that's billions of years of geological time. Some people say the Homo sapiens has been around for 100,000 years, some for as long as 250,000. No one says less than 100,000. Francis Collins, the great Christian believer who did the Human Genome Project, says certainly 100,000. I'll take 100. Richard Dawkins thinks it's more. I'll take 100. What does it mean if we're divinely supervised and divinely created and looked out for? It means that for 98 or so thousand of those years, humans, Homo sapiens, were being born, dying, half of them in childbirth, I would think. Life expectancy maybe of 20 years, maybe of 30, people dying essentially of their teeth, out of hideous diseases, living in permanent fear. Where are the earthquakes coming from? Where are the lightning strikes coming from? Why is all this? What are these diseases that hit us? We don't know about microbes, we have no idea. That's to say nothing about the fights with neighboring tribes over women, over land, over meat, over subsistence, the torture, the violence, the cruelty that goes on. I don't need to underline all of it, I hope. You can picture it for yourself. 98,000, the first 98,000 years, heaven watches this going on with perfect insouciance. And something like 2,000 to 3,000 years ago decides, right, we have to intervene now. We have to do something about this. Well, what would be the best way of intervening to try and redeem this rather bleak picture? What about having somebody tortured to death in an obscure part of the Middle East? That ought to cure it. Or if you're a Muslim, what about getting an illiterate epileptic shepherd to start babbling and saying that he's been talking to an archangel? Or what about inventing the figure of Moses in a mountain that's never yet been found by any geographer of Mount Sinai? That's what you'd have to believe. I've got a minute, right? That's what you'd have to believe, and that's why I ask myself, why do the worshippers of this God want to convict him of being such a crummy designer? Most of his creations die off, and the rest suffer miserably. And the redemptive offers just don't somehow take, of being cruel and capricious and bungling and incompetent. Why, and callous as a father. And so, since this is as far as I can get now, I have to tell you why I don't think the idea of an eternal father is a good one in any case when I next get the chance to draw breath. But thank you for staying with me this far.
I agree very much with Christopher Hitchens in his repudiation of many of the evils that he claims have been done in the name of God. But I've learned to distinguish between the greatness of God and the inexcusable evil that has been done by those professing his name. And so I do not deduce that God is not great and that religion poisons everything. After all, if I fail to distinguish between the genius of Einstein and the abuse of his science to create weapons of mass destruction, I might be tempted to say science is not great and technology poisons everything. What is more, as I look back at the evils of atheist regimes of the 20th century, I might also be tempted, ladies and gentlemen, to say atheism is not great. It has poisoned everything. As it is, I hold that science shows some of the greatness of God. The famous physicist James Clerk Maxwell, who discovered electromagnetic theory, inscribed above the door in his laboratory in Cambridge University the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." Yet Christopher Hitchens says, thanks to the telescope and the microscope, religion no longer offers an explanation of anything. I find it impossible as a scientist to take such a statement seriously, as if using a microscope and a Rembrandt painting could disprove the existence of Rembrandt himself. The idea that God and science are mutually exclusive explanations of the universe is as wrong as saying that internal combustion and Henry Ford are mutually exclusive explanations of the automobile. They are complementary explanations. One explains how it works, the other why it exists. To think that as the reach of our instruments increases, the greatness of God the Creator somehow diminished is to make the mistake of confusing mechanism with agency. When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, now I know how the universe works, I don't need God. No, his wonder at how it was done increased his admiration for the Creator who'd done it that way. And Newton wrote the most famous scientific treatise of all time, the Principia Mathematica, in the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in a deity. Telescopes can show us the wonder of the night sky, but science didn't put the stars there, nor did the laws of biology and physics, ladies and gentlemen. They describe what is there, they don't put it there. Stephen Hawking says the usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question why there should be a universe for the model to describe. He then asks, why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Does it need a creator? Yes, it does need a creator. Alan Sandage, widely regarded as one of the fathers of modern astronomy, discovered quasars, said, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. And another giant of cosmology, Arno Penzias, won his Nobel Prize for discovering an echo of the Big Bang. But Penzias could see how unimaginably greater is the God who conceived of this beginning to space-time in the first place. Astronomy, he says, leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with a very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Einstein had the brilliant insight that the speed of light was an absolute constant. But what shall we say of the creative mind that said, let there be light, and there was light? To measure the speed of light is one thing, to create light is another. Far from science showing God is not great, as Christopher Hitchens suggests, the very opposite is the case. It was belief in God that motivated the advance of science in the 16th and 17th centuries. Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton expected to find law in nature because they believed in a great lawgiver. Now, so often we hear the new atheists talk about faith and deprecating it. But I want to tell you that scientists are all people of faith, as Einstein saw. They believe that the universe is accessible to the human mind. And physics cannot explain that for the simple reason that you can't do physics without believing that the universe is intelligible. So scientists required faith, and yet I read Christopher Hitchens saying, if one must have faith to believe in something, then the likelihood of that something having truth or value is considerably diminished. Pardon? Well, one must have faith that the universe is intelligible to do science. So I'm to deduce, am I, that the likelihood of science having truth or value is considerably diminished? Exit science then. And I presume that Christopher Hitchens, like most of the rest of us, believes in his own existence. Yes, am I to take it then that the likelihood he really does exist is considerably diminished? His statement is a self-refuting statement. And I find it ironical that the so-called new atheists are so passionate about ridding the world of faith that they appear to be blind to the fact that they themselves are driven by faith. They believe that their minds can grasp truth. They believe in science. They believe that God is not great. Yet Mr. Hitchens informs us in a classic oxymoron, our principles are not a faith. Our beliefs are not a belief. The mind boggles, ladies and gentlemen. That is not the only irony, for the new atheists offer no ground for the faith that they themselves cannot do without. After all, if human life has been cobbled together by mindless, unguided processes, why should we trust our cognitive faculties and the validity of any belief that they produce, atheism and science included? John Gray gets it exactly right. Modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Well, this reduces all rationality to zero. And far from atheism being great, it seems to me that it is irrational, anti-scientific, and incoherent, even though emotionally its proponents seem unable to take this on board. Now, as the early pioneers of science saw, the rational justification of science is provided by the existence of the Creator, who created not only the universe, but the human mind that studies it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him. That makes perfect sense to me as a mathematician. Science is important, but it has its limitations. It cannot answer the questions of a child. What are we here for? What is the meaning of life? Nor can it tell us whether literature or art is good or bad. Hence, an atheism that insists that science is the only way to truth diminishes human beings. This is very obvious to many of my Russian friends. We thought we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings, but we found we couldn't. Do away with the greatness of God, ladies and gentlemen, and you can do away with the nobility of human beings endowed with all the potential of hearts and minds made in God's image. You also do away with their freedom. You are left with a mindless, unguided process that somehow threw humans up at its endless lottery to exist without ultimate hope for a tiny moment, only to be crushed by the same blind forces that produced them. Some freedom that. Another evidence of the greatness of God consists in the ordinary freedoms that we often take for granted. Here's an influential German atheist thinker, Jürgen Habermas, and he says this: Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the benchmarks of Western civilization. To this day, we have no other option. We continue to nourish ourselves from this source. Everything else is postmodern chatter. It was Christianity, not atheism, incidentally, that originally gave us the universities that educated the new atheists, gave them the liberty that permits them to propagate their views and the law that protects them as well as the rest of us. And yet Christopher Hitchens insists that the God he does not believe in is a tyrant and a bully, as we've just heard. I don't actually believe in such a God either. It is so alien to my own knowledge and experience. But I might point out as an aside that atheism is no solution to tyranny either, as the bloodbath of the 20th century shows only too well. But there's another deep problem here. To say that God is not great is a moral statement. To say he's tyrannical is a moral statement, and that must be based on some moral standard. Otherwise, you couldn't distinguish evil from its opposite. But if there is no eternal base for values external to humanity, how can Mr. Hitchens or anyone else's standards be anything but limited human conventions, ultimately meaningless products of a blind, unguided evolutionary process? How can random mutations and blind selection produce any morality at all, let alone the kind of apparently invincible morality that justifies the new atheist intolerance of religion? John Gray points out that the new atheists defend liberal freedoms without asking where they come from. Hard atheists like Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre will want to know how atheists can rationally justify their absolute sounding commitment to timeless values without implicitly invoking God. They would say you cannot. And Richard Dawkins gets close to hard atheism when he says that in a universe of blind physical forces, you won't find any reason or rhyme nor any justice. The universe has the properties that we should expect if there is no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. But if Hitler or Pol Pot or you and I are simply dancing to our DNA, no one can blame us for anything. All morality is gone. So the claim that God is not great, being a moral claim, dissolves into utter meaninglessness. And here we meet a strange contradiction. That the atheism seems to me, ironically, to deny the one thing that upholds moral values, that is justice. For millions, ladies and gentlemen, there is no justice in this life. And according to atheism, they will never get it after death, since death's the end. So the terrorists who dance to their DNA on the bodies of their victims get away with it. They will not get away with it, ladies and gentlemen. Because here is another aspect of the greatness of God, that he is the ultimate judge of mankind. There is to be a judgment at which justice will be done fairly. In England at the moment, atheists have paid for an advertising campaign where buses carry a message: there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Why is it that atheists associate God with worry? Is that they fear to meet him as judge? They don't like judgment, but I can't help noticing sometimes how judgmental they are. German Marxist thinker Max Horkheimer said a very interesting thing. He feared there might not be a God, since then there would be no judgment and no justice. And here we have a dilemma. The problem of my human guilt on the one hand and my desire for justice on the other. I want justice, but what will justice say to me? And what about God? Is he really the despot they make him out to be? No, there's yet more to his greatness. God is not only the great creator and judge, he's a God of grace and love. And the central claim of Christianity is this: that as an expression of his love, God himself became human. The Word became flesh. Christ shows us as none other the greatness of God. He made unique claims to be the truth, to be the Son of God, and backed them up by a life and teaching without parallel. But his moral teaching was not his main message. His stated mission was to deal with the moral chasm that separates us humans from God by taking our sins on himself. Ladies and gentlemen, we scientists cannot even tell you what energy is. So don't be surprised if I cannot completely explain to you the deepest mystery of our universe's history, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Yet just as we see the effect of and use energy without completely understanding it, what I do observe is the transformation, the peace, the hope that comes into the lives of ordinary men and women who learn to place their faith, their confidence, their trust in Christ as Savior and God. I see in them and experience in myself a transcendent sense of purpose that atheism does not have, and a hope that atheism does not know. It is here, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, that the greatness of God is supremely manifest. Thank you.
Well, let me do this in reverse order and see if I have enough time left over to complete my first burst, as it were. I think I gave you fair warning, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, that Dr. Lennox would have to claim to know more than he can possibly know, and he by no means let me down. He knows that he's saved. He knows who's saved him. He even knows who hung the stars in the sky. How he knows this, I don't know. It was a bravura performance in its way, but I don't think if you're going to claim to know who put the stars up there, that you should be citing Albert Einstein. If there's a copy of my Portable Atheist on sale afterwards, and I hope there is, if it isn't, it is available at fine bookstores everywhere. I have several pages of painstaking denials by Albert Einstein that he had or ever had any belief at all of any sort in a personal God or a savior or a divine revelation. He was at pains to repudiate this. He thought it was both sinister and childish as well as unscientific. The furthest he would go would be an illustration of the distinction I labored in vain to make between deism and theism, between a name you might give to a process or an order or a law of nature and the idea of an intervening, vengeful, supervising, caring God, a personal one. That's the only distinction I hope to make, and it was one that Dr. Lennox treated as if it was non-existent, as you may have noticed. Einstein may not be used by those who believe in revelation or personal God. Now, okay, on the something and nothing question, let's stay with science for a moment. Edwin Hubble noticed a few years ago, as many of you will know, that the universe was continuing to expand and at quite a rapid rate away from itself. But it was thought by people who were still thinking in what you might call Newtonian terms, that though that rate of expansion was remarkable and rather alarming, it would obviously have to start slowing down, decelerating at a certain point. To the contrary, it's recently been discovered by a very brilliant physicist, Lawrence Krauss, that in fact the rate of expansion is increasing and quite rapidly. The universe is expanding very, very fast. Very soon, if we hadn't been around at this particular point in time, there wouldn't be enough evidence left around in the red light shift for us to know that the Big Bang had ever even taken place. We're only picking that up from signals from a long time ago, which will soon be unintelligible. I'm saying soon, using billions of years as an index of time, of course, light years, if you will. Not light years, they're distances, but you know what I mean. Distances and times that are rightly called astronomical. What does this mean? It means that, though there is now something, after all, I am here, I do firmly believe, and I'm very happy to see all of you here too, especially those of you who paid for your tickets. It means that very soon there will be nothing. A lot of nothingness is headed our way. It's going to be all over quite soon. You can see it coming. Read the Lawrence Krauss, Edwin Hubble stuff. It's going to explode away. It's going to fall apart. And if, that is, a couple of things don't happen sooner than that, we can already see the Andromeda Galaxy in the night sky. You can actually see it some nights without really the aid of a telescope, headed directly on collision course for our own. We have an appointment, ladies and gentlemen, with the Andromeda Galaxy. It's going to crash right into ours. There's something now. Enjoy it while you can. Nothing is coming. Whose design is that, may I inquire? Or perhaps before that, it's very possible that before any of this happens, we won't have to worry about it because our sun will simply swell up into a red dwarf, our oceans will boil, life on this planet will become extinct, and then the sun will collapse into itself and go the way that millions and millions and millions of other stars have. We can see them imploding and exploding and shooting themselves to death all over the sky as it is. Nothingness, there's a lot of nothingness. So those who want to claim the credit for the something, what deity is going to claim the credit for the nothingness? And who went to all this trouble, this fantastic explosion of nothingness, these infinite spaces of nothingness, and with the destiny of destruction written in every galaxy, in order to create this one privileged planet with this one very shivering, uncertain, vulnerable primate species on it that's only been here for 100,000 suffering years and has only been offered redemption for 2,000. Look first upon this picture and on that. Look at the absolute extraordinary scale that's proposed on the one hand. and the absolutely, or not even microcosmic on the other. And I don't believe you can possibly take any claim of religion seriously here. Whatever is the explanation for this, people who say, well, since we don't know, we may as well say it's God, are simply drumming their fingers. They're wasting their time and they're trying to waste yours. Now, on this question of who's boss and why I don't think the Eternal Father idea is a good one. I'm sure I'm not the only father here. I have 3 children. My job as a father is to get out of their way, is to do my best for them and then make room for them. What if I was to say to them, oh, don't worry, I'll always be here. Not as in, I'll always be here for you, as in, I'm never going away. You'll never see the back of me. You'll never get to say goodbye, Daddy. No, I'll always be here. In fact, I'll be here long after you've died. In fact, I'm rather looking forward to that, because then I can sit in judgment on you. This is not even a benevolent form of despotism, is it? When you allow yourself to think about it. It's somewhat worse than I was saying before about the way that religion makes people first be terribly abject and then terribly solipsistic and arrogant and conceited. If it were true that all these things are attributable to an eternal Father who is unknowable except by those who claim, as Dr. Lennox does, sources of information denied to me and many other people, what would it mean at the minimum? It would mean we were living under an unalterable, unchallengeable dictatorship, which might or might not be benign. We've no assurance it would be benign. In my view, benign dictatorships are the worst, but that's another story. It would mean we were subjected to everlasting, round-the-clock surveillance, waking and sleeping. We would never have a private moment. Everything we did and thought would be known and supervised and invigilated and either rewarded or punished. Even Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984 couldn't be absolutely sure what all his subjects were thinking. But there was the crime of thought crime. You could be charged with it. Under the divine dispensation, no problem. You're convicted of thought crime before you've even had the thought, because everything is knowable. And how would the God who convicted you know? Because he'd already created you full of dirt and sin and wickedness. That's part of the design. And the horror of it, the fascistic element of it, is this. You're created sick, and then you're ordered to be well. So you're created full of dirty thoughts and wickedness and wrong ambitions and impure and foul nature, and then you're told, you better cure yourself pretty fast, otherwise I won't be answerable for the consequences. This is the worst imaginable kind of unfreedom, and I have to say I distrust those who wish that it were true. In my opinion, the original emancipation, the first emancipation that humans must undergo is the freeing of themselves from this man-made and mind-forged manacle. It might be asked, why don't I want it to be true? Why don't I wish it to be true? Well, I'll tell you, because once you admit that this despot exists, you will find yourself in the real world, in the here and now, subjected to the rule of man-made power, purely man-made power, ruled by other primates and other mammals who claim the right to do anything they want with you because they have God on their side and because their rule is divine. This is not a theoretical danger. I'll illustrate it in a different way if you like, and take up Dr. Lennox's point about the origins of morality. If you think that we wouldn't know right from wrong, we'd have no concept of good and evil, or the right action or the wrong action, or the right thought or the wrong thought, if we didn't have the permission of a supernatural celestial dictator, if that's where our ideas of good and evil come from, then let me ask 2 questions of you. First, okay, I'll ask the questions and I'll leave it with the questions, and I hope I'll get a response later. You must now, ladies and gentlemen, if you believe this, you must tell me of a right action performed or a right statement, moral statement made by a believer, such as Dr. Lennox, that I could not make myself or couldn't state myself, something that only he could do as a believer that was right and moral and I could not do because I'm not a believer. I've asked this question in a lot of places now and to a lot of people, including senior bishops and archbishops and others. I have not yet had an answer to it, and there must be a good answer if they are to make the claim that faith licenses morality and ethics. And then my second question, corollary question, much easier. Please think of a wicked action done by someone purely because they are a person of faith. Think of an evil thing said or an evil thing done that is only done because the person is religious. You've already thought of one. The suicide bombing community is entirely religious, faith-based. The genital mutilation community is entirely faith-based. You know how it goes. While these two questions hang in the air, I will bow out, let you brood on them. I hope you'll feed some of them back to me. And once again, my thanks, and back to Dr. Lennox.
Well now, I'll not be able to deal with all of these, but let me do my very best to talk about them. You've missed completely my point about Einstein. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you noticed I didn't mention anything at all about Einstein's belief in God, because I'm completely aware of all that Christopher Hitchens had said. The point I made was that Einstein believed that all scientists had faith. That is a completely different thing, a faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe that was real faith. And my argument had nothing whatsoever to do with Einstein's belief in God. He mentioned in his initial speech that the idea of the Creator had been completely refuted by the question, you must ask who created the Creator, and you get into an infinite regress. I discussed that with Richard Dawkins in my debate in Oxford. If you have to ask the question, who created the Creator, that means you believe in a created God. And created gods are a delusion. We've known that for centuries, and we don't need to be told it. If you say who created the Creator, it means also that you cannot conceive of anything that's eternal. And I don't know what Mr. Hitchens' views on the universe are, or in mass energy, but the incapacity to believe in eternal is essentially the issue. My final point on that would be this. I said to Richard Dawkins, I can ask you the same question, because you believe that the universe created you. So I would like to know who created your Creator. But he doesn't seem to have an answer to that. Now then, you referred to the universe and its expansion and collapse from the beginning to the end. And you said, what's the point of the whole thing? I would agree with you if I believed that the universe was a permanent phenomenon. But one of the things I understand from the New Testament is that the universe never was meant to be a permanent phenomenon, but is a stepping stage. I cannot go into what the Bible has to say about the notion of new heavens and a new earth, but I would simply want to say that this is something that is very clear in the Bible itself, which claims that the universe will end up in a massive heat death. This is something not new with science. And the point is that God is going to have a new manifestation. And that is why his plans are much bigger than we see within the confines of this present universe. But there was quite a lot of emphasis in Christopher Hitchens' talk on certainty. He said those who say they are certain are discredited. But he was absolutely certain when we spoke that supernatural is to be ruled out, that no one can know the mind of God. How is he so certain about that, if you can't be certain about anything? Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is actually important, because I would not like to give you the impression that my certainty is the certainty of arrogance. It's rather this, that I believe that behind this universe there is a God who loves you and me so much that he's taken the initiative and revealed himself to us. And the key question that underlines this whole discussion is this: Is there such a thing as revelation? Because then it's not a question of arrogance, it's a question simply of accepting things for which there is evidence. So I would zero in to the central claim of Christianity, which is this, that God became human, the Word became flesh. And as a scientist, I want to say that my response to that is there any evidence for it? That Jesus is whom he claimed to be. He claimed to be revealing God. And if Christopher Hitchens, for example, reveals something about himself to me, then it's not arrogance for me to believe it. But I will never know him unless he's prepared to do that. It's exactly the same with God. Unless he reveals himself to me, of course I cannot get to know him. But if he reveals himself, then that's a completely different situation. So it's got to stand or fall on the question as to whether there is any evidence for Christ's claim to be God. Because if he is God, then certainly there are some things that we can know about God for the simple reason that he has told them to us. And for me, of course, the central evidence is the fact that Jesus Christ literally rose from the dead on the third day. Now, I'm sad when I hear Christopher Hitchens' caricature of God as a celestial big brother, always watching us, trying to spoil our fun. That is an invented God, ladies and gentlemen. Because the God that I know is a God that cares for me and has created the possibility of a real relationship with me. I might as well say, who would want to be married and have a woman or a man in their home constantly watching them, constantly supervising them, constantly looking out for them? That would be absurd, because it's to take one aspect of watching over and to distort it into a universalized explanation. Ladies and gentlemen, aren't you glad that there are police in this country watching over you? Aren't you glad that there are people? Incidentally, I think Mr. Hitchens and I are enjoying the fact that you're watching us tonight. And it's not inhibiting us at all. We're enjoying it. There's a watching that's good, and there's a watching that's bad. And if you abolish God's watching, I notice that we ended up in the Orwellian situation in Eastern Europe with Big Brother watching. What did people think of that in 1989? They voted very clearly against that atheist kind of supervision. And it was in fact the Christians that led the silent revolution in Eastern Germany that knocked the wall down. There's a false kind of watching, and I agree with Mr. Hitchens on it, but there's a true kind of watching. Because the relationship with God is not something that's forced. It's a real relationship of love. We've been given freedom. I heard a real caricature of the biblical story in saying that God had created us sick. God made a perfect world, ladies and gentlemen. But he made us in his image with the capacity of real freedom and real choice. So that if we say no to God, God will honor that choice. I wonder what Mr. Hitchens would want God to do with people that say no to him. He seems to have difficulty with the idea that God will honor the choice of those that say no. Why is that? Because God hates them and is some cosmic tyrant? Of course not. It's because God actually loves them. Now, these things are sometimes hard to grasp because there are so many distortions of God around in the world. And that's why, again and again, I come back to look at the person of Christ who reveals God to me, to look at his love and his friendship and his care. And if I ask myself the question, would I like to be in the company of that person permanently? My answer is a resounding yes. I can think of nothing more liberating and nothing more utterly magnificent that expresses the greatness of God. Now, we heard a challenge from Mr. Hitchens that he throws out all over the place. Can we think of a right action that can be made only by a Christian and not by an atheist? It's actually a very subtly interesting question to me, because there are certain presuppositions behind it that I'd like to briefly deal with in closing. One is this: from where I sit, ladies and gentlemen, whether a person is an atheist or a Christian or anything else, they are made in the image of God, and therefore they are moral beings. Therefore they're capable of seeing good and doing good. And sometimes my atheist friends could put me to shame. So there is that basic moral compass, which makes Mr. Hitchens' question a little bit beside the point. But if I were going to answer his question directly, I'm not convinced that William Wilberforce would have liberated slavery as he did if his motivation had been atheism. Because I noticed that Wilberforce liberated slaves only to have slavery reintroduced by Nazi Germany and communism in the 20th century. There is no guarantee, ladies and gentlemen, that the abolition of God will mean the abolition of the captivity of man. But my final answer to his question is this: can I name a good action that no atheist could do? Yes, I can. I can name one that no person of whatever worldview could do, and that is to give his life for the sins of the world. It is that characterized Jesus Christ as the one who was God, and that is unparalleled in its majesty and in its confirmation that God is truly great.